Hi, I'm Jonathan Broughton and I'm Head of Strategy at the European Broadcasting Union. Today I'm here to talk to you for about 10-15 minutes about what happened during the pandemic, potentially the implications for us in the industry afterwards. So I'm greatly looking forward to seeing all of you in the sun at Dubrovnik. But first, a little bit of data and strategy for you ahead of the day. First off, I'm going to start with content. Seems a logical place to start with things that were affected the most during the pandemic. So my first little treat is a slightly complicated slide which details various age groups during the pandemic. We saw viewing across all different mediums increasing by a large amount. The most obvious were the most accessible, so things like online video streaming, but also people craving contact with their friends, their loved ones, their family. So a rise in messaging services and social media, and also sort of an increased focus on those shared experiences that were no longer available. One really interesting thing is that we saw an absolutely huge spike right at the start of the pandemic, a whole flurry of activity. Here I've got a various range of sort of digital and physical activities. What was really interesting is that as the pandemic went on, this flurry of viewing was not sustained. I think we all remember picking up some very strange hobbies during the pandemic, and a lot of this replaced some of the digital viewing that we'd seen right at the start. Potentially a positive note there. People find interesting things to do with their time outside of sitting in front of the television all the time. But also a lot of these sort of learned behaviors, the learned habits are sustained afterwards. So both a slight reduction in viewing spent going forwards, but also interests in new hobbies and new activities developed during the pandemic that are sustained afterwards. So possibly a positive there. And for content creators, something to think about in terms of a broadened horizon for the audience. We also saw some quite drastic changes in the types of content that were being consumed. Most notably, we saw a huge drop in cinema viewing, mainly because cinemas were closed. But certain analysts do really expect a massive return to cinema viewing. So for those filmmakers among you, there's an expectation that consumer spending will return, not necessarily immediately, but certainly by 2024, there'll be a very healthy spend on cinema and film in person. Secondly, during lockdown, we saw some drastic changes in the genres that were being consumed. There's a lot to be said about escapism and need for sort of moods being lightened in general. So we saw big spikes in entertainment and news and even religious content as people sought to be a little bit reassured. And these increases in viewing were way ahead of the increase in actually the availability of the content. So although content owners, distributors, owners of various service and broadcasters did make more of these kinds of content available, the increase in viewing was far in excess of that. So definitely people seeking a little bit of escapism. Final slide on content by country. So a lot of the information you've seen is sort of amalgamated across multiple different regions. This is a split from some Omdia data where they dig into the various platforms country by country, and we see this very similar pattern no matter where we are. It slightly correlates, of course, with the severity and duration of lockdown, but we saw across all platforms, we saw this nice sustained spike of growth. Linear did sort of business as normal in some cases, and we saw this huge growth story in anything that was digital, accessible online, partially due to the number of screens in a house that are available, but also due to the sort of functional availability of library and content and things like that. Let's talk about people who are, of course, at the focus of all of this. One of the core concerns for people during the pandemic was not just the kinds of content that they had available, but how much they could actually rely on that. So specifically for news and news-based content, so anything informational, we saw an evolution in how consumers feel about how much they can trust that content. At the European Broadcasting Union, obviously we work with public service media, And one of the fascinating things about this is we've seen a slight drop in trust over the last few years. But as soon as the kinds of information or needs of consumers, of users, are so important to them that they're almost matters of life and death, they turn back to PSM, and specifically things like radio, and of course sort of the 9 or 8 o'clock news slots suddenly become extremely important to people. It's not ubiquitous. What we also found was that younger audiences again trust the PSM a little bit, yes, and older users are likely to trust a little bit more. But certainly there's some reaffirming news around how well traditional means or mechanisms of communicating are trusted. And secondly, we saw a lot of information arising around misinformation, perhaps, both online, but most specifically social media. And it was really nice to see this downwards trend of trust in social media. So although we do still have ongoing problems with misinformation being spread on social media, in general, populations are increasingly learning not to trust everything they see online, and specifically on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, but instead to take them with a pinch of salt, to find secondary resources and not necessarily believe the first thing that they see. Secondly, for those people who were locked down for long periods of time, stress and mental health were a real growing concern, which hasn't necessarily changed. We talk a lot about working from home habits at the moment. In some ways, they're very positive. We get to spend perhaps more time with our family. But there are some negatives about this. So there are some groups of the population who are more negatively affected. They feel a bit more stressed. Certainly through the pandemic, this was far more obvious, and it disproportionately affected the very young, so Gen Z, and also women who tended to have extra sort of domestic burdens placed on them, as well as their sort of new working lives, which seems incredibly unfair, but was a trend that was fairly ubiquitous across many different countries. So something perhaps we need to think about there. Finally, on working from home, really interestingly, I think, is the more productive chart we have here. So 30% of people in our survey, a survey we took at a company called Workshare, said they were more productive than working from home. A few said they were less productive. And the majority of people said it sort of depends on what we're doing, which makes an awful lot of sense. And I think there's been a lot of debate about working from home from various sort of business leaders over the last few months. Some are very in favor of it, some are very against it. I think in general, we need to think about this middle bar. It depends on the task. So we need to perhaps think about how to design our working week where we can make the most of being from home and make the most of being from the office, because it does seem that in general, working from home is here to stay. And on that note, what's next? What's next for us following the pandemic? Some really interesting research here from McKinsey, who are in general seeing vast changes in jobs and sort of functions that we do. So although some of the job titles will stay the same, many of them will be very different kinds of work. So partially this is due to shifts in flexible workspaces and the kind of roles that we'll be moving to here. And part of this is sort of general futuristic needs as individuals and companies move from large cities and perhaps move into suburbs, rural areas, small cities, towns and villages. More on that in just a second. But it does seem that there's a rather large shift, and you can see that the job types in blue on this particular chart. And partially this is driven by reactions to the pandemic and the overall changes that we experience in our lives. What does this mean for media? People's knowledge is changing, people's experiences are changing. The things they're interested in will be different in 5 years than they are today, perhaps a little bit obvious. But it is driven by pandemic, and it is driven by the changes in our lifestyle. So perhaps think about what this means for the kind of content these people are consuming or going to consume. What I mean in kind of the use case of your content in terms of how people engage with it and what they're trying to get back from it. Is it escapism? Is it learning? I talked a little bit about working from home just before. There's a really interesting correlation between working from home and where people want to live. Obviously, if you work from home, you don't necessarily need to live in a tiny flat in the center of a large city. You can live in a slightly larger house out in the country, and in your sort of free time, go for large walks and play with the sheep and that kind of thing. What's really interesting is just how much people engage with working from home post-pandemic. So we got a little taste of it a couple of years ago, and now 98% of people say that at some point in their career they want working from home. So it's effectively a need for them. I'd suggest business leaders need to embrace this, otherwise you'll find yourself at a disadvantage for competing with talent. However, I've got a couple of stats which also need to be borne in mind. It's not completely positive. So 30% of workers said when they're working remotely, they get a little bit lonely. So we need to think about how to engage with people, how to make sure they're nice and happy. And there are also some issues with the end of the working day. A lot of people who work from home work from a room where they do multiple different things. They work from that room. They also have some form of entertainment in that room. And so separating those boundaries can be difficult for them and introduce stress. So there's certain kinds of training and behaviors that perhaps businesses can think about instilling in their workers to help them separate their work and their life and be overall more happy and productive. So here's my final slide. This is a little bit long term. So this is talking about the next sort of 10, 15 years, all the way up to 2030. And it's from some European Union data, which is compiled into their Louisa report, which is available online. It's a fascinating read. And it's all about where we're going to live in the future. And it's not the same everywhere. In Eastern Europe, there seems to be a bit of a trend towards people moving into towns. And in Western Europe, there's a very strong trend in increases in rural population. So I do suggest if you're targeting certain regions, have a quick look at this map, because it's very interesting in terms of how people are going to change how they work, what their commute's going to be like, and also to some extent what hobbies and lifestyle they'll be using in the future. And some of these changes are really high, so up to 35% in some areas shifts from urban to rural populations. So big changes in how people are living and how they're engaging. When you're designing the kind of content you're going to make from these people, it changes how and where they're consuming this content, as well as the kinds of content that they're actually interested in. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you've learned a thing or two. I tried to make this presentation a little bit different from a lot of the trends that we saw over the pandemic. So I hope you found it useful, informative, and good for designing the future of your business. Thanks for listening.